Story 1. The Loom of Burning Threads. The traveler moved through the thick dust of the road toward Rajgir, his mind a frantic loom weaving the same jagged pattern of a decade-old betrayal until the physical world appeared only as a pale shadow of his internal torment. He carried the weight of a singular event as if it were a physical stone pressed against his sternum, unaware that the friction of his memory was what generated the heat of his current suffering. As he encountered the silent figure of the Buddha sitting beneath a gnarled pipal tree, the man did not see a teacher but rather a mirror reflecting the exhaustion of his own cyclic thoughts. Every step he had taken across the plains of India was not a movement through space, but a repetition of a mental state that refused to dissolve into the void of the past. The trauma was not located in the history of the event itself, but in the specific way his consciousness clutched the jagged edges of the memory, mistaking the residue for the reality. The Buddha observed the man not as a fixed identity, but as a fluid process of causation where every thought functioned as a seed planted in the fertile soil of the present moment. To the man, the betrayal was a permanent feature of his soul. Yet the philosopher's sage perceived only the mechanics of a mind that had forgotten how to release the tension of its own grip. The internal landscape of the traveler was a kingdom under siege by ghosts, where the original injury had long ago ceased to exist in the physical realm but continued to be fed by the man's constant attention. This sustained focus was the true essence of his karma, a self-perpetuating volition that insisted on reviving the dead at the expense of the living. As the traveler sat in the dust near the sage, the silence of the forest began to penetrate the noise of his recollection, revealing the strange truth that his pain required his participation to survive. He began to observe the rise and fall of his breath, noticing how the thought of the old enemy would tighten his throat and shorten his stride. The realization dawned slowly that he was the architect of his own prison, using the bricks of yesterday to build walls that obscured the horizon of today. The trauma was revealed as a series of mental formations, none of which possessed an independent existence apart from the consciousness that observed them. He saw that the past was a ghost ship sailing on an ocean of current choices, and that by withdrawing the wind of his interest, the vessel would eventually sink into the depths of equanimity. The karma he had feared was not a punishment from the heavens, but the simple law of inertia governing his own habits of thought. To heal was not to rewrite the past, but to recognize the futility of trying to breathe life into a statue. The man watched as the image of his betrayer dissolved into a collection of impersonal elements, no more substantial than the dust dancing in a shaft of late afternoon sunlight. His mind, once a closed loop of resentment, began to expand into the vastness of the forest, feeling the cool air and the damp earth without the filter of his previous narrative. The heavy stone against his chest did not vanish through a miracle, but through the simple act of opening his hand. He understood then that the Buddha was not offering him a new story to replace the old one, but was pointing toward the space between stories where the self is finally allowed to rest. The silence between them became a bridge over which the traveler walked away from his history, leaving the burning threads of his memory to turn into ash in the quietude of the awakening mind. There was no longer a victim and no longer an offender, only the rhythm of the wind in the leaves and the profound stillness of a consciousness that had finally stopped trying to win a war that had ended 20 years ago. He stood up with a lightness that felt like a foreign language, realizing that his life was not a record of what had been done to him, but a canvas of what he was doing in this very breath. The road ahead was no longer a path toward a destination, but an expression of his newfound freedom from the gravity of the unchangeable. The journey continued, yet the traveler was gone. Story 2. The Architecture of Abandoned Echoes. Within the shaded confines of the Jetavana monastery, a woman sat motionless, her presence defined by a profound void that seemed to pull the very light from the air around her. She had come seeking an end to the grief that had hollowed out her existence after the loss of her child, believing that her sorrow was a fundamental truth written into the fabric of the universe. Her mind was a museum of echoes, curated with such precision that every shadow in the monastery reminded her of a presence that was no longer there. She viewed her trauma as a sacred monument, unaware that her devotion to this monument was the very mechanism that kept her from the peace she claimed to desire. The Buddha watched her from the edge of the clearing, seeing not a grieving mother but a complex intersection of mental aggregates clinging to a concept of ownership that had been shattered by the law of impermanence. He did not offer words of comfort that would only reinforce her identity as a sufferer, but instead invited her to examine the substance of her pain. As she sat in the stillness, she was forced to confront the internal architecture of her loss, discovering that her grief was not a single entity, but a shifting mosaic of memories, physical sensations, and speculative futures that would never occur. The karma of her condition was the habitual way her mind associated the feeling of love with the necessity of an object, creating a dependency that transformed a natural ending into a perpetual tragedy. She began to see that her mind was like a weaver who had run out of silk but continued to move the shuttle back and forth, creating nothing but the sound of effort. The trauma was the sound of that empty shuttle hitting the frame of her consciousness over and over again. In the silence of the monastery, the woman started to observe the way her mind constructed the image of the child out of thin air, only to collapse in agony when the image failed to respond. This cycle of construction and collapse was the engine of her suffering, a mental habit that she had mistaken for the depth of her love. The Buddha's presence acted as a stabilizing force, allowing her to look into the abyss of her own perception without falling into the trap of despair. She saw that the child was a river that had flowed into the sea, and that her attempt to hold on to the river's form was a denial of the water's true nature. Her karma was the resistance to the flow of change, a stubborn insistence that the world should conform to her desire for permanence. As the hours passed, the boundaries of her self-pity began to soften, and she perceived the interconnectedness of all suffering beings, realizing that her grief was not a private burden, but a shared pulse of the human condition. The isolation of her trauma dissolved as she recognized the same patterns of grasping in the monks, the villagers, and the very animals in the forest. This realization did not diminish her loss, but placed it within a vast cosmic context where the individual I is nothing more than a momentary ripple in an infinite ocean. The healing began when she stopped trying to fix the past and started to observe the birth of each new moment in her awareness. She noticed how the mind would reach for a painful thought like a hand reaching for a familiar tool, and she practiced the subtle art of letting the hand remain still. The echoes in the museum of her mind began to fade, not because the memories were deleted, but because the room had been opened to the wind and the light. She understood that she could not bring the child back, but she could stop murdering her own peace in the name of a memory. The structure of her identity as a grieving mother fell away, leaving behind a clear and spacious awareness that was capable of holding the memory of the child without being consumed by it. By the time the sun began to set behind the hills of Savatthi, the woman was no longer the person who had entered the monastery that morning. She stood up and walked toward the gate, her movements no longer heavy with the gravity of the past, but light with the buoyancy of the unburdened present. The architecture of her echoes had collapsed, and in its place was the simple, radiant fact of being alive without the need for a reason. Her karma had been transformed from a chain into a horizon. Story 3. the echo of the unstruck bell. The man stood at the threshold of the deep forest near the base of Vulture Peak, his posture bent by the invisible weight of 1,000 days spent in the service of a king's violent ambitions. Every rustle of the dry leaves beneath his feet sounded to his ears like the whisper of a victim, for his mind had become a specialized instrument for the detection of his own guilt. He perceived his history not as a sequence of events that had concluded, but as a living, breathing entity that followed him like a predator through the dappled light of the ancient trees. The trauma he carried was a form of self-inflicted surveillance, a relentless monitoring of his internal landscape for the slightest sign of the cruelty he had once enacted. He sought the Buddha not for forgiveness, which he believed was a theological impossibility, but for a way to stop the internal vibration of a bell that had been struck years ago and yet refused to go silent. When he finally observed the Tathagata sitting in the stillness of a narrow ravine, the man was struck by the absence of a narrative in the sage's presence. The Buddha did not look at him through the lens of his past actions, but saw the current structure of his suffering as a mechanical process of cause and effect. To the man, his karma was a stain on his soul, but to the philosopher monk, it was the ongoing momentum of a specific mental volition that could be interrupted by the clarity of awareness. The man's mind was like a river that had been diverted into a stagnant pool, where the water grew dark and heavy with the sediment of his memories. He began to sit in the silence of the ravine, watching the way his thoughts would reach out to grab the image of a fallen enemy, dragging it back into the present with the strength of a drowning man. He realized that the trauma was not the original blow he had dealt or received, but the persistent pulse of his own intention to remain a prisoner of that moment. The silence of the forest was not an empty space, but a profound laboratory where he could examine the anatomy of his regret. He saw that the I who had committed the acts was a phantom composed of greed, hatred, and delusion, and that the I who now suffered was a phantom composed of the residue of those same forces. Neither entity possessed a permanent core. The healing process was the slow deconstruction of the bridge between who he was and who he thought he had been. As he practiced the observation of his breath, he noticed that each inhalation was entirely new, untouched by the blood on his hands from a decade prior. The karma of his past was like a fire that required the fuel of his current attention to continue burning. By withdrawing his identification with the story of the soldier, he began to starve the flames of his torment. The faces in the clouds and the whispers in the leaves did not disappear through a ritual of absolution, but through the realization that they were projections of a mind that had forgotten how to exist in the unadorned present. The man felt the iron shroud around his heart begin to crack, revealing not a forgiven man, but a spacious consciousness that was no longer interested in the maintenance of a self-loathing identity. He understood that his past was a series of shadows cast by a sun that had already set, and that by turning his gaze toward the horizon of the now, he could finally step out of the darkness. The bell of his trauma stopped vibrating not because the past had changed, but because the medium of his mind had become too vast and still to sustain the resonance of the old strike. He walked away from the ravine not as a man who had been healed of a wound, but as a man who had realized that the wound was a fiction he had been writing every morning for 3,000 days. The forest remained silent, and for the first time in his life, so did he. Story 4. The Garden of Severed Roots. The woman spent her days in the outskirts of a village near Vaishali, tending to a small patch of earth with a devotion that bordered on the pathological. She believed that the drought that had withered her family's fortunes and the illness that had taken her kin were the direct results of an ancestral curse. a dark karmic inheritance that she was destined to carry like a physical deformity. Her mind was a garden of severed roots, where she spent every waking hour digging through the soil of her memory to find the original seed of her misfortune. She viewed her life as a predetermined script written by the errors of those who had come before her. And this belief functioned as a psychological paralysis that prevented her from planting anything new. When the Buddha passed through her village, she did not see a savior, but a challenge to her entire worldview of fated despair. He sat by the village well, his presence radiating a profound indifference to the concepts of luck and destiny that governed the lives of the townspeople. The woman observed him from her gate, noticing how his every movement seemed to arise from a place of total spontaneity rather than from a script of the past. To her, the trauma was a legacy, but to the sage, it was a dissolution of the present moment into the imaginary dictates of a dead history. He taught that karma was not a debt inherited from the bloodline, but the very shape of the vessel one chose to be in this moment. The woman's mind had become a vessel shaped by the expectation of tragedy, and thus it could hold nothing but the bitter water of her own resentment. She began to sit in meditation under the shade of a neem tree, turning her attention inward to the way her thoughts were constantly searching for evidence of her curse. She saw that when a bird sang, she heard a warning, and when the wind blew, she felt a threat. This pattern of interpretation was the true source of her trauma, a mental habit that filtered the neutral data of the world through a screen of preconceived suffering. She realized that the curse was simply the momentum of her own defensive posture. The trauma was not what had happened to her ancestors, but the way she had modeled her own consciousness after their shadows. As she sat in the stillness, she practiced letting go of the need to explain her current state through the lens of the past. She began to perceive the raw sensations of the heat on her skin and the smell of the dry earth without attaching the story of her family's ruin to them. In this unmediated contact with reality, the roots of her suffering were found to be floating in the air, disconnected from the actual ground of existence. The karma she had feared was revealed to be a phantom limb, a sensation of pain in a part of her life that no longer existed. The healing was not a restoration of what was lost, but a realization that the loss itself was a mental construction. She saw that the earth did not care about her lineage, and the rain did not fall or withhold itself based on her moral history. This impersonality of the universe was not a cruelty, but a supreme liberation. It meant that she was free to begin again with every single breath, unburdened by the weight of 1,000 years of mistakes she had not made. The garden of her mind began to change, not because she had found the original seed of evil, but because she had stopped digging in the graveyard and started to observe the light in the clearing. The woman stood up and walked to the well, drawing water with a grace that came from the absence of a ghost at her shoulder. She understood that her life was not a consequence but a creation, and that the only curse she had ever suffered from was the belief that she was not the master of her own attention. The roots of her trauma had dried up and turned to dust in the sun of her awareness, leaving the soil of her heart ready for a seed that was not of the past. The drought in her soul had finally ended. Story 5: The Mirror of Internalized Eyes. The man lived on the periphery of a village near the kingdom of Kosala, existing in a state of perpetual flinching as if the very air were composed of the sharp tongues of his neighbors. Years ago, a public humiliation had stripped him of his status, and though the original event had long since died into cold white ash, his mind continued to inhabit the moment of the burning. He saw his life as a series of defensive maneuvers designed to hide a shame that had become his only identity, unaware that he was the one keeping the fire alive by constantly scanning the faces of others for the reflection of his own self-loathing. His mind was a courtroom where he was simultaneously the judge, the prosecutor, and the trembling defendant, replaying the evidence of his failure until the present moment was entirely obscured by the fog of his obsession. The trauma was not the past rejection, but the current habit of viewing himself through the imagined eyes of a hostile world. When the Buddha arrived in the village during the height of the monsoon, the man observed the sage walking through the thick mud with a composure that suggested he was not moving through a village of people but through a field of shifting weather patterns. The Buddha did not look at the man with pity or judgment, but with a gaze that perceived the complex machinery of his distress as a series of impersonal causes and effects. To the man, his karma was a permanent stain of dishonor. But to the philosopher sage, it was the ongoing volition of a mind that had forgotten how to stand in its own center. The healing began in the silence of the rainy evenings, as the man sat near the edge of the monastery and began to observe the rise of his own defensiveness. He noticed how the thought of a villager's laugh would trigger a contraction in his chest, and he started to investigate the substance of that contraction. He found that the shame was not a solid thing, but a collection of flickering mental images and physical tensions that required his constant belief to remain cohesive. He began to practice the art of looking directly at the I who felt ashamed, and in doing so, he discovered that this I was merely another thought appearing in the vastness of his awareness. The realization dawned that the village's opinion was a sound in the air, no more significant than the croaking of frogs in the nearby marsh, unless he chose to weave that sound into the shroud of his own identity. His karma was revealed not as a debt he owed to society, but as the specific way he had trained his mind to prioritize the shadows of the past over the light of the present. As he sat in the stillness, the man achieved a state of transparency where the words of others could no longer find a surface to strike. The trauma dissolved not because the villagers had changed their minds, but because the man had ceased to be a target for his own arrows. He saw that the honorable self he had lost was as much of a fiction as the shameful self he had carried, and in that space of dual absence, he found a peace that required no external validation. The courtroom in his mind was finally dismissed, and the man walked back into the village with a heart that was as open and indifferent as the sky after a storm. He understood then that to be free was not to be liked by all, but to realize that the one who seeks approval is the same one who creates the prison. The mud of the road did not bother him, for he was no longer carrying the weight of the world's eyes on his back. He was simply a consciousness moving through the world, untouched by the concepts of glory or disgrace, resting in the profound equanimity of the unstruck bell. The past was gone because he had stopped inviting it to sit at his table. Story 6. The River of Unborn Possibilities. The former merchant sat on the banks of the river Achiravati near Shravasti, his hands tracing the deep lines of his palms as if they were maps of a kingdom he had lost to a single night of fire and miscalculation. His trauma was the relentless haunting of the what if, a mental ghost that showed him a parallel life where his wealth was intact, his family was alive, and his status was undisputed. He viewed his current state of poverty not as a new beginning, but as a failed ending, a broken fragment of a destiny that had been derailed by a single moment of negligence. His mind was a library of unwritten books, each volume dedicated to the person he believed he was supposed to be. And this attachment to a non-existent reality made the actual ground beneath his feet feel like a bed of burning coals. The Buddha watched the merchant from the shade of a mango grove, seeing a man who was drowning in the middle of a dry field because he refused to stop imagining the flood. To the merchant, his suffering was the result of a catastrophic error. But to the sage, the trauma was the result of the mind's refusal to accept the law of dependent origination. The Buddha taught that every event is the result of 10,000 causes, and that to isolate one moment as the turning point is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of reality. The idea of a single coincidence being the source of ruin was a delusion that ignored the infinite web of causality in which every life is suspended. As the merchant began to attend the evening discourses, he was invited to look at the river and notice how the water was never the same from one second to the next. He saw that the merchant, who had lost everything, was a collection of causes that had already dispersed, and that the sufferer who sat on the bank was a new collection of causes arising in response to a memory. The healing was found in the realization that the life he should have had was a mental construction with no more substance than the reflection of the moon in the flowing water. He began to examine the structure of his regret and found that it was built on the arrogance of believing he could have controlled a universe that is fundamentally uncontrollable. His karma was not the loss of his gold, but the persistent craving for a version of reality that did not exist. By letting go of the phantom life, he began to experience the vividness of the life he was actually living. He noticed the taste of his simple alms food, the feeling of the wind against his skin, and the profound quiet of the forest at dawn. The trauma dissolved as he understood that there was no path not taken, for the path is created by the very act of walking. The merchant's identity as a victim of fate fell away, replaced by a spacious awareness that was no longer divided against itself. He saw that the fire that had burned his mansion was not an enemy, but a transformation of energy, and that his grief was the result of trying to hold onto a form that the universe had already decided to change. The river continued to flow, and for the first time, the man flowed with it, no longer anchored to the wreckage of a dead past. He found that in the absence of his great expectations, there was a great peace that wealth could never have purchased. He was no longer a man who had lost everything, but a man who had discovered that there was nothing to lose in a world of constant flux. The library of unwritten books in his mind burned to ash, and in the resulting clarity, he saw the stars for the first time without the filter of his own disappointment. His karma had been resolved through the simple, radical act of being exactly where he was. The journey was over, and the silence was complete.